The coat fabric bunched in fingers so small they barely closed around the expensive wool, yet the grip held firm enough to stop conversation at every table, within 15 feet of where Dominic Caruso sat conducting business that never appeared on official ledgers. Matteo Reyes stood 4 feet tall in shoes that had been taped at the soles to keep the rubber from separating, his knuckles white against the charcoal cashmere that cost more than 3 months of his sister's rent. The boy's chest heaved with breaths that came too fast, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, despite the November cold that had followed him through the restaurant's heavy brass doors. "Your driver hit my sister." The words tumbled out, cracked and desperate, carrying across the sudden silence with the clarity of a church bell. "She's bleeding. Please come now." Dominic's hand had frozen mid-gesture, suspended in the amber light that gave Luciano's its reputation for discretion and its clientele. Their preferred shadows. The 2 men across from him, associates whose names appeared nowhere near the operations they discussed, shifted in their seats with the instinctive tension of those who recognize disruption as potential threat. But the boy's eyes held something that made Dominic's fingers slowly lower to the white tablecloth. Not fear, though terror lived somewhere beneath the surface of that small face. Not anger, though accusation burned in every syllable. What stopped Dominic cold was recognition, the specific quality of desperation that only emerged when someone had exhausted every other option and arrived at the last door that might open. The restaurant existed in a pocket of suspended animation. Forks hovered over plates of ossobuco that would grow cold. Wine glasses caught light, but found no lips. Even the soft jazz filtering through hidden speakers seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the man at the corner table to determine whether this moment would end in removal or revelation. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Where? Dominic's voice emerged quiet, stripped of the warmth he employed for legitimate business contacts, and the ice he reserved for those who disappointed him. This was something else, a single word carrying the weight of immediate decision. Matteo's grip tightened rather than released, as if he understood instinctively that letting go meant losing the only leverage his nearly 7 years on Earth had ever granted him. The parking structure on Halsted. 4th floor. She was walking home from work and... His voice cracked, childhood reasserting itself despite the adult burden he'd somehow shouldered. "There's so much blood. She told me to run. She told me to find someone who could help. And you found me." The observation carried no judgment, merely acknowledgement of the impossible path this child had navigated to reach this table. "She said the car had your name on it." Matteo's words came faster now, tumbling over each other as fear and hope collided in his small chest. "The writing on the door. She reads everything to me because I'm still learning. And she said it was one of your cars. And you're the only person in the whole city who can make someone answer for what they did." The associates exchanged glances that communicated entire strategies without sound. One reached toward his jacket's interior, not for a weapon but for a phone, recognizing that this moment required verification before response. Dominic stopped him with a raised finger, the same gesture that had frozen more dangerous men in more threatening circumstances. "The car," Dominic said, his attention never leaving Matteo's face. "Describe it." "Black, with the gold letters on the side. Caruso. The boy spelled it out with the careful precision of someone who had memorized those letters during endless walks past vehicles he couldn't afford to ride in. And there was a scratch on the back, a long one. She noticed it because she notices everything. Something shifted behind Dominic's eyes, a calculation completing itself, producing results he clearly didn't appreciate. Only 3 vehicles bore his name in that particular configuration, and only one had recently acquired damage that hadn't yet been repaired. The scratch had come from a delivery gone wrong 3 weeks prior, when crates had shifted during unloading and scraped against the sedan's rear quarter panel. Marco's car. Marco, who had worked as Dominic's secondary driver for 2 years. Marco, whose routes never varied without explicit permission. Marco, who had no authorized business anywhere near the Halsted Street parking structure on a Tuesday night. "Sit down," Dominic told the boy, and something in his tone must have communicated safety, because Matteo's fingers finally unclenched from the expensive impropolis, wool. The child's legs seemed to lose their strength the moment he released his anchor, and he half collapsed into the chair one of the associates had vacated with smooth efficiency. A server materialized from the direction of the kitchen, her face carefully arranged to hide the curiosity that everyone in this establishment cultivated as survival instinct. She set a glass of water before the boy without being asked, then disappeared before her presence could register as interference. Matteo stared at the glass but made no move to drink, his attention fixed on Dominic, with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every detail of this moment. The way the light caught the silver, threading through dark hair at the man's temples, the controlled stillness of hands that could sign death warrants or mercy with equal ease, the eyes that revealed nothing while absorbing everything. "What's your sister's name?" The question came gentle, almost soft, but it carried weight that made the boy straighten slightly in his chair. Elena Reyes. She's a nurse at Northwestern, the ER. Pride flickered through his fear, a brother's admiration surfacing despite the circumstances. She works nights so she can take me to school in the mornings and help with homework before her shift starts. She does everything. The word everything landed with meaning beyond its simple definition. It spoke of a woman carrying burdens that should have been distributed across family members who weren't present, of sacrifice normalized through necessity, of love expressed through exhaustion rather than abundance. Dominic processed this information alongside the accusation that had brought the boy to his table. A night shift nurse walking home from Northwestern would pass through the Halsted Street parking structure, only if she were taking a shortcut, the kind of route someone chose when they were too tired to add extra blocks to an already punishing commute. And Marco had been there, in a car, bearing Dominic's name, conducting business that existed nowhere in the mental ledger Dominic maintained of his organization's activities. How bad? The question emerged with edges that made both remaining associates lean slightly backward, recognizing the particular quality of controlled anger that preceded consequences. Matteo's lower lip trembled before he caught it between his teeth, forcing composure onto features too young to carry it. She couldn't stand up. She told me she was fine, but she couldn't stand up, and her leg. He stopped, swallowed, tried again. It looked wrong, bent wrong, and there was blood coming from her head where she hit the concrete. The image assembled itself in Dominic's mind, with the precision of someone who had witnessed too much violence to require imagination. A woman walking home through a parking structure, probably checking her phone or simply existing in the exhausted autopilot of someone finishing a 12-hour shift, headlights appearing, too fast. Impact. The sound of a body meeting pavement at speed. And then a car driving away. A car with his name on the door. A car operated by someone he had trusted enough to grant access to his world. "Mr. Dominic." One of the associates spoke for the first time, his voice pitched low enough to carry only to the immediate table. "Should I call ahead? Have someone waiting at the structure? Call an ambulance." Dominic was already rising, his movements carrying the fluid economy of someone who had spent decades making decisions that couldn't wait for deliberation. "Then find Marco. I want to know where he is, where he's been, and what he thinks he's been doing with my property and my name for the last," he calculated quickly, 6 months. "Start there." The associate nodded and stepped away, phone already pressed to his ear as he navigated toward the restaurant's entrance with the urgency of someone who understood that this particular instruction permitted no delay. Dominic looked down at Matteo, who had watched this exchange with wide eyes that missed nothing despite understanding perhaps half of what the words implied. The boy sat surrounded by wealth he had never touched, crystal stemware, linen napkins, silverware that could have fed his family for a month if melted down and sold. Yet his attention remained fixed on Dominic's face, searching for something he clearly needed to find. "You're coming with me." It wasn't a question, and Matteo didn't treat it as one. He slid from the chair with the automatic obedience of a child who had learned that adults made decisions and children followed them, especially when those decisions pointed toward the people they loved. They moved through the restaurant together, the man in the $3,000 suit, and the boy in second-hand clothes that had been chosen for durability rather than appearance. Conversations didn't resume as they passed. The other diners had absorbed enough to understand that tonight's dinner would come with a story they would tell carefully, in select company, for years to come. The November air hit them like a physical assault when they stepped through Luciano's brass doors, the temperature differential sharp enough to steal breath. Matteo shivered violently but said nothing, his jaw set with determination that seemed borrowed from someone much older. A black car materialized at the curb as if summoned by thought, not the damaged sedan, but one of Dominic's personal vehicles, driven by someone whose loyalty had been tested in ways Marco apparently never had been. The driver emerged and opened the rear door without a word, his eyes flicking briefly to the child before settling into professional neutrality. Halsted street structure, Dominic said as he guided Matteo into the leather interior. 4th floor. Fast! The boy pressed himself into the corner of the seat, making himself small in the way of children who had learned that occupying less space meant avoiding attention that might turn painful. His hands gripped his knees, knuckles showing white again as the car began to move. Dominic settled beside him, maintaining distance that communicated safety rather than threat. The city slid past the tinted windows in streams of light and shadow, storefronts closing for the night, restaurants spilling warmth onto cold sidewalks, the ordinary rhythms of Chicago continuing, unaware of the rupture occurring in its hidden architecture. "How did you know where to find me?" The question emerged without accusation, genuine curiosity about the mechanics of this impossible intersection. Matteo's voice came small but steady. "Elena told me about the restaurant once. She said the man who runs the neighborhood eats there every Tuesday, and that knowing where powerful people are is how regular people stay safe." He paused, considering whether to continue, then added, "She wasn't supposed to tell me stuff like that. She said it after a long shift when she was too tired to remember I was listening." The observation landed with unexpected weight. This nurse, this woman who walked home through parking structures because she couldn't afford gas money or cab fare, had been teaching her brother to navigate a world where power operated through knowledge rather than permission. She had given him maps to territory he should never have needed to cross. And tonight, that knowledge had brought him to the one table where his accusation might actually produce results. "She's going to be angry," Matteo said suddenly, his voice cracking again. "When she finds out I came here. She told me to find help, but she meant I don't know. A police officer. Someone safe. Am I not safe?" Dominic's question carried no offense, merely interest in how this child perceived the line between protection and danger. Matteo considered this with seriousness beyond his years. "Elena says you're the most dangerous person in the city, but she also says you're the only one who actually does what he says he'll do. And right now I need someone who'll promise to help her." The child's logic carried its own devastating clarity. In a world where institutions failed and authorities ignored neighborhoods like his, trust flowed toward whoever demonstrated reliability, even if that reliability came wrapped in danger. The car turned onto Halsted, the parking structure looming ahead with its concrete levels rising like a brutalist monument against the Chicago skyline. Dominic could see the flashing lights before they reached the entrance, blue and red strobing against gray walls, the unmistakable signature of emergency response. "Someone called 911, the driver reported, glancing at Dominic through the rearview mirror. "Looks like they got here about 10 minutes ago." Matteo pressed his face to the window, searching the chaos of emergency vehicles and uniformed figures for the one shape that mattered. His breath fogged the glass in rapid bursts, fear, manifesting in respiratory patterns he couldn't control. The car stopped at the structure's entrance, where a police officer had positioned herself to control access. She approached the window with the particular wariness that came from encountering expensive vehicles and crime scenes, her hand resting near her weapon without actually touching it. The driver lowered his window, producing credentials that Dominic had long ago arranged for situations requiring official cooperation. The officer examined them, glanced at the vehicle's occupants, and stepped back with the resigned acceptance of someone who understood which battles weren't worth fighting. They were waved through. The 4th floor emerged from the spiral ramp like a stage set for tragedy, harsh fluorescent lights illuminating a scene that Matteo would remember for the rest of his life. An ambulance sat with its rear doors open, EMTs moving with the controlled urgency of professionals managing serious but not immediately fatal injuries. And there, on a stretcher being loaded into the ambulance's interior, lay Elena Reyes. Matteo was out of the car before it fully stopped, his small legs carrying him across oil-stained concrete toward the sister who had raised him, protected him, and taught him survival skills she probably hadn't realized she was imparting. An EMT intercepted him 3 feet from the stretcher, arms catching him with the practiced reflexes of someone accustomed to managing distressed family members. Matteo. Elena's voice emerged weaker than her brother had ever heard it, but the relief beneath the pain was unmistakable. Oh God. How did you? Dominic approached more slowly, his presence registering on the scene with the subtle displacement that accompanied genuine authority. The EMTs glanced at him and continued their work, but their movements became fractionally more careful, their attention more thorough. The police officer who had been taking photographs of skid, marks, and blood spatter looked up, recognition flickering across her features before professional neutrality reasserted itself. Elena's eyes found Dominic over her brother's head, and even through the fog of pain and shock, comprehension dawned with terrible clarity. She saw the tailored suit, the controlled stillness, the way every official present adjusted their behavior around his presence, and she understood exactly where her brother had gone to find help. Matteo. Her voice emerged, strangled, emotion compressed into a single name. What did you do? The boy squirmed, free of the EMT's restraining arms, and climbed halfway onto the stretcher, pressing his face against his sister's shoulder with the desperate need of someone who had spent an hour believing he might never touch her again. I found someone who keeps his word, he whispered. Just like you told me. Elena's gaze locked with Dominic's across the chaos of emergency response, and in that moment, something passed between them that would take months to fully understand. Not gratitude, she was too smart to feel gratitude toward the man whose organization had put her in this position. Not fear, though, she understood exactly how dangerous he was. What lived in her eyes was something closer to recognition. She saw him clearly, without the filters of reputation or rumor, and found herself being seen in return by someone whose attention usually meant catastrophe. The driver, she said, her voice steadying with effort. He came back. After he hit me, he came back, and I thought he was going to help. But instead, She stopped, swallowed. He stood over me and said if I told anyone about the packages in his trunk, things would get worse for my family. Then he left again. The confession transformed everything. This wasn't just a hit and run, an act of panic that might have been addressed with compensation and carefully managed consequences. This was deliberate intimidation. This was a threat made using knowledge that positioned Elena as a witness to something she should never have seen. Dominic felt the familiar cold settling into his chest, the place where other men kept rage. His anger had never been hot. It was glacial, slow, patient, and utterly comprehensive in its eventual expression. The packages, he said quietly. Tell me. Elena closed her eyes briefly, either from pain or from the weight of the decision she was about to make. When she opened them, she had committed to a path that would entangle her life with his, in ways neither could yet predict. I cut through this structure every night. 3 weeks ago, I saw a car with your name on it parked here at 2 a.m. I didn't think anything of it until I saw a man moving boxes into the trunk. Small boxes. He was wearing gloves, counting them like they were precious. She paused for breath, each word costing her something. I walked faster, pretended I didn't see. But tonight he was waiting. Like he knew my schedule. Like he knew I'd be alone. The implications cascaded through Dominic's understanding, reshaping his mental map of his organization's activities. Marco hadn't just been stealing, he'd been operating an entire secondary enterprise under the cover of Dominic's authority. The gold letters on the car door, the routes that went unchallenged because they bore his name, the trust that came with proximity to power. And when Elena Reyes had accidentally witnessed something she shouldn't have, Marco had decided that eliminating the witness was preferable to facing the consequences of his betrayal. Ma'am, We need to transport now." One of the EMTs inserted himself into the moment, with the professional insistence of someone whose priorities couldn't accommodate criminal investigation, or whatever strange negotiation was, occurring above their patient. "The leg needs surgery, and her head trauma requires imaging we can't do here." Elena nodded, but her hand found Matteo's and held on, with strength that belied her injuries. "My brother, I'll make sure he's safe." The words emerged from Dominic before he could calculate their wisdom, a commitment offered without the careful consideration he applied to every other decision. "You have my word." The phrase landed in the cold air between them with weight that surprised even him. He didn't give his word casually, it was a currency he hoarded precisely because it held value. Yet here, surrounded by the evidence of his organization's failure and the blood of a woman who had done nothing except walk home from helping others, the promise felt not just appropriate but necessary. Elena searched his face for the deception her circumstances should have taught her to expect, and found instead something she couldn't quite name. Not kindness, the word didn't fit the angles of his features or the reputation that preceded him, but perhaps reliability, perhaps the particular integrity of someone who built empires on the foundation of kept commitments. "Matteo," she said, squeezing her brother's hand. "You go with him. You behave. And you don't," her voice cracked, "you don't ask questions about what happens to the man who did this. Some things aren't for little boys to know." The instruction revealed depths of understanding that shouldn't have existed in someone who had lived her entire life outside his world. She knew what his involvement meant. She knew what consequences awaited Marco, and she was choosing to accept that knowledge while protecting her brother from its details. The EMTs lifted her stretcher into the ambulance with movements that suggested they'd been patient long enough. Matteo reached for her hand one more time, but the doors were already closing, separating them with finality that made the boy's shoulders shake with silent sobs he was too proud to voice. Dominic stood beside him as the ambulance pulled away, its siren splitting the night as it navigated toward Northwestern Memorial. The police officer who had been documenting the scene approached with a notebook and the carefully neutral expression of someone who knew exactly whose territory she had entered. "Mr. Caruso, we have some questions about the vehicle involved. Witnesses report seeing. The driver's name is Marco Benedetti." Dominic cut her off with information that would have taken her department days to uncover. "He's been operating outside sanctioned activities, using my property and reputation to conduct personal business. His current location is being determined as we speak. When I have an address, you'll receive it through the usual channels." The officer absorbed this with the practiced acceptance of someone who had learned that cooperation with certain parties produced better results than antagonism. She nodded once, made a note, and retreated to give Dominic space that she clearly understood he required. Matteo still stared after the ambulance, even though it had disappeared from view minutes ago. His small frame trembled with cold and delayed shock. The adrenaline that had carried him from the parking structure to the restaurant and back, finally draining away, to leave behind a boy who had seen too much and felt too powerless. "Come." Dominic placed one hand on the child's shoulder, the lightest possible touch, a guide rather than a grip. "There's nothing more to do here. We'll go somewhere warm and wait for news about your sister." The boy looked up at him with eyes that held questions far beyond his years. "What happens now?" Dominic considered lying the kind of comfortable fiction that adults use to shield children from realities too heavy for small shoulders. But something about Matteo's gaze demanded honesty, perhaps earned by the courage it had taken to walk into Luciano's and grab a stranger's coat with accusations that could have gotten him killed. "Now," Dominic said, guiding him toward the waiting car, "I find the man who hurt your sister, and I make sure he never hurts anyone else." It wasn't a threat. It was simply truth, delivered with the same matter-of-fact clarity that Matteo had used when spelling out the letters on the car door. Some things existed beyond negotiation, beyond mercy, beyond the civilized boundaries that governed ordinary life. Marco Benedetti had crossed every one of them, and in doing so, he had brought this boy to Dominic's table, transformed a simple act of cruelty into something that would ripple outward through carefully constructed power structures for months to come. The car door closed behind them, sealing out the cold and the flashing lights and the blood-stained concrete, where Elena Reyes had learned exactly how much her accidental witness had cost her. Inside the leather interior, warmth circulated through vents with a soft hum, and Matteo's shivering gradually subsided as his body registered safety it didn't yet know how to trust. Dominic watched the boy's reflection in the tinted window, small, exhausted, carrying weight that no 6-year-old should have to bear. The child who had walked into power without fear, because fear was a luxury he couldn't afford when his sister was bleeding on cold concrete. His phone buzzed with an incoming message. The associate from the restaurant, reporting that Marco had been located attempting to board a bus to Milwaukee. That containment would be achieved within the hour. That questions awaited their subject in a location far from ambulances and police officers and small boys with 2 old eyes. Dominic read the message without expression, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Your sister," he said quietly, not looking at Matteo directly. "She raised you well." The boy didn't respond, but something in his posture shifted a fractional release of tension that suggested the words had landed somewhere important. He pressed his forehead against the cool window glass and watched the city blur past, trusting the stranger beside him, because trust was all he had left to offer. And Dominic Caruso, who had built an empire on calculated decisions and strategic ruthlessness, found himself wondering when exactly this night had transformed from interrupted dinner into something that would require him to become a different kind of man entirely. The answer, he suspected, had started with a small hand closing around expensive wool, and a voice cutting through silence with the terrible clarity of desperation. "Your driver hit my sister. She's bleeding. Please come now." Some requests couldn't be refused. Not because of obligation or reputation or the complex mathematics of criminal enterprise, but because the person making them had already demonstrated a courage that demanded response in kind. The hospital corridor stretched before Elena like a tunnel carved from fluorescent light and antiseptic efficiency. 3 days had passed since the surgery that had rebuilt her shattered fibula with titanium plates and 12 screws. 3 days of morphine haze and fragmented sleep interrupted by nurses checking vitals and detectives asking questions. She answered with careful omissions. Matteo sat in the chair beside her bed, his legs swinging above linoleum that had witnessed countless vigils. He'd been here every moment, visiting hours permitted, delivered and collected by men whose faces changed, but whose professional watchfulness remained constant. Elena pretended not to notice the quality of the vehicles that appeared at the hospital entrance, the way staff moved differently when her brother's escorts walked the halls. The cast encasing her leg from ankle to knee itched with the specific torment of healing tissue trapped beneath plaster. Her head still ached where it had connected with concrete, the stitches hidden beneath hair she hadn't managed to wash properly since admission. But she was alive, and Matteo was safe, and somewhere in the city's shadow architecture, consequences were being delivered. To the man who had tried to make her disappear. She didn't ask about Marco Benedetti, didn't want to know which warehouse held him, which questions had been asked, which answers had proved insufficient. Some knowledge weighed too heavy, and she was already carrying more than her frame could sustain. "Mr. Dominic sent these." Matteo held up a paper bag that rustled with the particular sound of baked goods transported with care. "From that Italian place on Taylor Street. The nurse said you haven't been eating." Elena took the bag, peering inside to find cannoli and biscotti arranged with the precision of offerings meant to communicate something beyond appetite. The pastries came from a bakery she'd never visited, but had walked past countless times, wondering what kind of life allowed for spontaneous purchases of $5 cookies. "He shouldn't be sending you things," she said, the words automatic even as her fingers closed around a biscotti that smelled of anise and almonds. "We don't know him, Matteo. We don't owe him anything. He says we don't owe him." Her brother's voice carried the patient certainty of someone repeating information until it became true. "He says family takes care of family, and since his family hurt ours, that makes him responsible until you're better." The logic should have alarmed her. It did alarm her, somewhere beneath the pain medication and the exhaustion and the simple relief of being alive. But alarm required energy she'd depleted, and the biscotti was exactly as good as she'd always imagined it would be. A knock on the door frame preceded the arrival of a face she'd last seen in a parking structure surrounded by flashing lights. Dominic Caruso stood at the threshold of her hospital room, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her annual rent, his presence somehow making the institutional space feel smaller and more significant. "May I?" The question acknowledged boundaries that his reputation suggested he rarely observed. Elena's hand found Matteo's automatically, the gesture half protective and half seeking comfort from the only family she had left. "Would you leave if I said no?" Prezi. Yes. No hesitation, no qualification. Just the simple truth of someone who understood that trust couldn't be demanded, only earned. She studied him for a long moment, searching for the danger everyone insisted lived beneath his surface. What she found instead was patience, the willingness to stand in a doorway until she made a decision he would apparently respect either way. "Come in." The words emerged smaller than she'd intended, but he seemed to accept them at full value, entering the room with measured steps that brought him to the visitor's chair on the opposite side of her bed from Matteo. The space between them felt charged with everything they hadn't yet discussed. The driver, the packages, the promises made in crisis that might not survive contact with ordinary days. Elena waited for him to speak first, unwilling to cede whatever small power silence might grant her. Marco talked. Dominic's voice came flat, stripped of the emotion that the statement should have carried. Before he stopped being able to talk, he explained what he'd been doing with my vehicles and my name for the past 8 months. Elena's stomach tightened despite the morphine's numbing embrace. "I don't want to know." "You need to know." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity breaking through the careful neutrality he'd maintained since entering. Because what he was moving wasn't just stolen goods or off-book deliveries. He was running product for the Castellano family, using my roots, my cover, my protection to supply my competitors. The implications unfolded in Elena's mind, with the terrible logic of dominoes falling. She had witnessed not just theft but betrayal at its highest stakes, a connection between Dominic's organization and rivals who would kill to protect that intelligence. "They know about me." It wasn't a question. "Marco gave them your name and address the night he hit you." Insurance, he called it. A pressure point in case things went wrong with either side. Dominic's jaw tightened, the first crack in his controlled exterior. "The Castellanos have people watching your building. They've been there since before the surgery." Elena closed her eyes, the weight of this information settling onto shoulders that had already bent too far. She had stumbled into a war she hadn't known existed, and now her presence threatened both sides equally as witness, as leverage, as the loose end that powerful men couldn't afford to leave dangling. "What happens now?" The question emerged with edges of fear she couldn't quite hide. "Now you and your brother come somewhere safe." Dominic's response came immediate, as if he'd been waiting for her to arrive at this conclusion herself. "Somewhere my people control completely, where no one connected to the Castellanos can reach you." "For how long?" "Until I've resolved the situation." The vagueness was deliberate. She realized protection from knowledge she'd already said she didn't want. It could be weeks. It could be longer. Elena opened her eyes to find Matteo watching this exchange with an intensity that suggested he understood more than a child his age should. Her brother had walked into a restaurant full of dangerous men and grabbed a stranger's coat because she was bleeding on concrete. He had demonstrated courage that still made her chest ache with pride and terror in equal measure. She couldn't protect him by pretending the world was safer than it was. He already knew better. "If we go with you," she said carefully, "what does that make us? What do we owe you when this is over?" Dominic's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, surprise. Perhaps that she was negotiating rather than simply accepting. "You owe me nothing. This situation exists because my organization failed. Someone I trusted used my authority to create a problem that should never have touched you. That's not how the world works." Elena had spent too many years navigating systems that demanded payment for every service, official or otherwise. Nothing comes free. There's always a cost. The cost was paid by Marco Benedetti. The statement carried finality that made Elena's skin prickle, and by the men in my organization who knew what he was doing and chose silence over loyalty. "What I'm offering you isn't transaction, it's correction." The distinction felt important in ways she couldn't quite articulate. He wasn't framing her safety as a favor to be repaid, but as a debt he owed, a balance sheet where she held the surplus rather than the deficit. Where would we go? I have a house outside the city, private property, gated access, staff who understand discretion. He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. You'd have your own space, your own schedule. Matteo could continue his education through tutors I can arrange. You could focus on healing without worrying about whether the next person through your door means you harm. The offer painted a picture so far removed from Elena's ordinary existence that it felt like fiction, something from the romance novels she'd stopped reading years ago because they made her own life feel too small by comparison. My job, she said, grasping for practical objections that might anchor her to reality. I have shifts scheduled, bills that need paying, a life that doesn't stop because someone decided I saw too much. Your employer has been informed that you're taking extended medical leave. Your apartment lease has been renegotiated with building management who understand the importance of holding your unit. Your bills, he stopped, something flickering across his features. I've taken liberties that I should have asked permission for. The circumstances seemed to justify action over consultation. Elena absorbed this revelation with the particular numbness of someone who had already exceeded their capacity for shock. He had reached into her life and rearranged its architecture without asking, demonstrating exactly the kind of power that should have terrified her into refusal. Instead, she felt something closer to relief. The weight she'd been carrying alone for years since their parents' deaths, since Matteo's arrival in her care, since every decision became her exclusive responsibility had been partially lifted by someone else's hands, even if those hands belonged to a man whose business she didn't want to understand. Elena? Matteo's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, small but certain. He kept his promise. About making sure I was safe. About finding the man who hurt you. The observation carried the simple logic of childhood, where actions mattered more than intentions and trust flowed toward whoever demonstrated reliability. Her brother had assessed Dominic Caruso using the only metrics available to a 6-year-old and found him adequate. Maybe that was enough. Maybe, in a world where institutions failed and authorities ignored neighborhoods like theirs, trust built on kept promises was the most solid foundation available. Okay, the word emerged before she could second-guess it further. We'll come with you, but I want one thing clear. Dominic waited, his attention focused with an intensity that suggested her condition mattered to him. I'm not a pet project or a charity case. Whatever help you provide, I'm paying back. Not in money, I don't have any, but in work, or service, or whatever contribution I can make while we're under your protection. She held his gaze with as much strength as her depleted body could muster. I'm not the kind of person who accepts handouts without giving something in return. Something shifted in Dominic's expression approval, perhaps, or the recognition of a kindred spirit in the refusal to accept imbalanced scales. Your contribution, he said, slowly, as if the thought had just occurred to him, could start with your medical expertise. I have people who sometimes need care they can't seek through official channels, injuries that require treatment but not documentation. The offer was illegal, she understood that immediately. Providing off-books medical care to men whose wounds came from violence they couldn't report meant crossing lines her profession had spent years drawing. But it also meant utility, value, a role that transformed her from protected object to participating member of whatever temporary household she was about to enter. I'll need supplies, she said, the words emerging steadier than she'd expected. And a space to work that can be sterilized properly. Done. No hesitation. No negotiation, just agreement delivered with the efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems through resource allocation. Matteo grinned at Elena, with the uncomplex joy of a child who had somehow navigated disaster into improved circumstances. He didn't understand the full weight of what she'd just agreed to, the compromises and complications that weighted down the road she'd chosen. But he understood that his sister was going to be okay. That someone powerful had decided to protect them, that the courage he'd shown in grabbing Dominic's coat had produced results beyond anything he'd dared to hope. For now, that was enough. The house emerged from bare November trees, like something conjured from Elena's childhood imagination. A sprawling structure of stone and glass that seemed to exist in its own microclimate, protected from the harshness of approaching winter by architecture designed for permanence. The drive from the hospital had taken 45 minutes, navigating progressively quieter roads until they reached a gate where armed men checked identification and spoke into radios before allowing passage. Elena had watched the security protocols with professional interest, cataloging details that suggested preparation for threats more serious than ordinary crime. Matteo pressed his face to the car window, his eyes wide as the house revealed itself around a final curve. "It looks like a castle," he whispered, and Elena couldn't argue with the assessment. It was built in 1922 by a railroad executive who wanted his family to feel safe from the city's chaos, Dominic said from the seat beside her. "I bought it 6 years ago." The irony wasn't lost on me. Elena didn't respond, too absorbed in processing the reality of where she would apparently be living for the foreseeable future. The building's scale dwarfed every dwelling she'd ever occupied her childhood home, the series of apartments she'd rented since independence, the cramped unit where she and Matteo had been surviving on night shift wages and careful budgeting. The car stopped before an entrance where stone steps led to doors that looked like they belonged on a church. A woman appeared middle-aged, professional, wearing an expression that suggested she had managed stranger arrivals than an injured nurse and her small brother. "This is Ada," Dominic said as the driver helped Elena navigate from the vehicle, her crutches awkward on the gravel driveway. "She manages the household and will make sure you have everything you need." Ada's gaze swept over Elena with assessment that felt clinical rather than judgmental, cataloging injuries, calculating requirements, presumably planning logistics that would make the stay manageable. "Your rooms are on the ground floor," she said, her voice carrying the particular warmth of someone who had learned to provide comfort professionally. "Mr. Caruso mentioned your leg would make stairs difficult." The thoughtfulness of the arrangement landed with unexpected impact. Elena had spent so long solving her own problems that having someone anticipate her needs felt foreign, almost unsettling in its kindness. "Thank you," she managed, the words inadequate but sincere. "If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." Inside, the house revealed itself as a series of spaces that balanced grandeur with surprising warmth. The entryway's marble floors gave way to hallways lined with art that Elena couldn't have named but recognized as expensive. Matteo stayed close to her side, his earlier bravado diminishing in the face of wealth so far beyond his experience that it might as well have been another planet. Their rooms occupied a corner of the ground floor, connected by a door that could remain open or closed depending on their preference. Elena's space featured a bed larger than any she'd seen outside of hotels, windows that looked onto gardens currently stripped bare by autumn, and a bathroom where the tub looked deep enough to qualify as therapy. A hospital bed rail had been attached to one side of the mattress, a modification that must have been made in the days before her discharge, anticipating her arrival in ways that suggested planning she hadn't been told about. "There's a call button by the bed," Ada explained, pointing to a discreet panel on the nightstand. "It connects to the kitchen, to security, and to Mr. Caruso's personal line. If you need anything at all, someone will come." Elena nodded, overwhelmed by options she didn't know how to navigate. Her life had been built on self-sufficiency, on the understanding that help rarely came, and when it did, the price always exceeded the value. Being surrounded by resources she hadn't earned felt like stepping into a world where gravity operated differently. Matteo had already claimed his room, his voice carrying through the connecting door as he discovered a bookshelf stocked with age-appropriate reading and a window seat perfect for the hours he'd spend watching unfamiliar grounds. The adjustment seemed to cost him nothing. Children possessed flexibility that adults had to work to maintain. "The kitchen serves meals at 7, 12, and 6, Ada continued, her efficiency suggesting this orientation speech had been refined through repetition. "But if those times don't suit your recovery schedule, we can arrange alternatives. Mr. Caruso usually eats separately, but he's mentioned that you and your brother are welcome at his table whenever you choose." The invitation carried weight that Elena recognized without fully understanding. Eating together meant something in cultures that organized power through inclusion and exclusion, through who sat at which tables and who waited on those who did. "We'll start with the regular schedule," Elena said, choosing observation over engagement. "Until I understand how things work here." Ada's slight smile suggested approval of this cautious approach. "Very wise. I'll leave you to rest. The first few days are always hardest." Alone with her. Thoughts for the first time since the parking structure. Elena lowered herself onto the bed, a process that required negotiating her cast with careful attention, and stared at a ceiling adorned with architectural details her apartment had never possessed. Crown molding. Subtle patterns pressed into plaster that had probably been touched by craftsmen whose skills no longer existed. She was inside the heart of everything she'd spent her adult life, avoiding the shadow architecture of Chicago's underground economy, the spaces where power operated without accountability and consequences arrived without warning. She was here because a man she didn't know had decided she deserved protection, because her brother had shown courage that still made her heart ache, because walking home through a parking structure at the wrong moment had transformed her from invisible civilian to valuable witness. The exhaustion she'd been fighting since the surgery finally won, pulling her into sleep before she could finish cataloging her fears. Healing happened in increments so small they were only visible in retrospect. Days accumulated into weeks, and Elena's world contracted to the rhythm of the house meals that appeared without her effort, medical supplies that materialized when she needed them. The slow process of strengthening her leg through exercises a physical therapist conducted 3 times weekly. Matteo adapted with the resilience of childhood, his days organized around tutors who arrived each morning and departed each afternoon, leaving behind homework that he attacked with diligence that hadn't characterized his approach to school before everything changed. The security guards whose shifts rotated through the property learned his name, his preferences, his habit of asking questions about their previous lives before this assignment. Elena watched her brother flourish in ways she hadn't anticipated: access to education, resources she could never have afforded, stability that came from knowing where the next meal originated, the simple security of adults who took his safety seriously rather than viewing it as someone else's problem. The guilt of providing this through circumstances she hadn't chosen warred with the relief of watching him thrive. Her medical work began 3 weeks after arrival, when Dominic appeared at her door with a request that had clearly cost him something to make. "One of my men was injured last night," he said without preamble. "The wound isn't life-threatening, but it requires care beyond what we can provide internally." Elena had been expecting this moment since agreeing to the arrangement. She set aside the book she'd been reading, one of dozens she'd found in a library that occupied an entire wing of the house, and reached for her crutches. "Show me." The makeshift clinic occupied a converted storage room in the house's basement, equipped with supplies that exceeded what most urgent care facilities stocked. Elena surveyed the space with professional assessment, noting the surgical quality lighting, the sterilization equipment, the cabinets labeled with pharmaceutical precision. "This is better than the ER I worked at for 3 years, she said, unable to keep surprise from her voice. "I believe in proper tools." Dominic stood in the doorway, his presence a reminder that she wasn't operating independently but within a structure he controlled. "The man who needs your help is named Torres. He was shot during a situation that went sideways in ways we're still investigating." Elena absorbed the word "shot" with the particular calm that years of emergency medicine had cultivated. She had treated gunshot wounds before they appeared in ERs more often than public health advocates liked to acknowledge, but never outside the protective framework of institutional protocols. "What kind of weapon? What's the wound location?" 9mm, right shoulder. "Through and through, which means no retrieval. Necessary, but the damage is significant." Torres turned out to be a man in his 40s whose stoic expression suggested pain he was refusing to acknowledge. His shoulder had been wrapped with bandages that spoke of basic competence but not medical training. The bleeding was controlled, but the wound needed proper cleaning and closure. Elena worked in silence for 2 hours, cleaning tissue, assessing damage, suturing with skills that felt strange outside their normal context. Dominic watched from a corner of the room, his attention constant but not intrusive, observing without interfering, present without dominating. When she finished, Torres flexed his hand experimentally and nodded once. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying weight that suggested gratitude extended beyond the medical care itself. Elena cleaned her instruments with the automatic precision of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times, processing the implications of what she'd just done. She had treated a man injured during criminal activity, provided care that would leave no record, participated in a system that operated outside every legal framework she'd sworn to respect. But Torres would keep the use of his arm. His shoulder would heal properly instead of festering into infection that could have killed him. She had applied her skills to reduce suffering, which was the core of everything her profession had taught her to value. The ethical lines she'd drawn around herself felt less clear than they had before entering this house. "You did well." Dominic's voice came quiet as Torres departed with instructions Elena had written on paper that would later be destroyed. "He would have gone to someone less skilled if you hadn't been here. The outcome would have been worse." Elena stripped off her gloves with more force than necessary. "Is that supposed to make me feel better about what I just did? It's supposed to make you understand the reality you're living in now." He stepped closer, his presence filling the clinical space in ways that made her acutely aware of how alone they were. "You can choose to see this as corruption of your principles, or you can recognize that you're saving lives that wouldn't be saved otherwise. The moral calculation isn't simple, but it's yours to make." She looked up at him, really looked, for the first time since they'd arrived at this house. What she found wasn't the monster her imagination had constructed from reputation and rumor. What she found was a man who carried weight in his eyes, exhaustion tempered by responsibility, power modified by awareness of its costs. "Why do you care what I think?" The question emerged before she could stop it. Dominic was silent for a long moment, his expression revealing nothing and everything. "Because your brother walked into my restaurant and reminded me that courage deserves response. Because you're the first person in years who's looked at me like I might be more than what everyone assumes." He paused, something shifting in his voice. "Because I've spent so long being what this life requires that I'd forgotten there might be other possibilities." The confession hung between them, heavier than the medical supplies on the shelves, more significant than the blood she'd just cleaned from her instruments. Elena didn't know how to respond. This was territory her experience hadn't prepared her to navigate: intimacy, suggested through vulnerability, connection forming in the spaces between their vastly different worlds. "I need to check on Matteo," she said finally, retreating toward ground that felt safer. Dominic nodded, making no move to stop her withdrawal. "Of course. But Elena," she paused at the door, "thank you for helping Torres. Whatever you're feeling about it, what you did mattered." The weeks that followed established patterns that began to feel almost normal. Elena treated 3 more of Dominic's people injuries that ranged from knife wounds to broken bones sustained during activities she deliberately didn't ask about. Her clinic became a space where the moral complexity she'd resisted simply existed alongside the practical good her skills provided. Matteo thrived in ways that made her heart ache with complicated joy. His reading improved dramatically under the attention of tutors who could devote hours to his specific needs. He laughed more freely than she'd heard since before their parents' accident, the sound carrying through hallways that had started to feel like home despite everything she knew about where that home existed. She saw Dominic most evenings now, their paths crossing in libraries and dining rooms, and the garden pathways where she tested her healing leg against increasingly ambitious walks. Their conversations evolved from cautious exchanges to something approaching genuine dialogue discussions about books they'd both read, philosophies they'd developed through vastly different experiences, the nature of responsibility and the weight of choices made without perfect information. He learned that she'd wanted to be a dancer before her parents' deaths made practicality more important than dreams. She learned that he'd inherited his position from a father whose methods he'd spent years trying to reform without losing control of the organization that inheritance had built. They were dancing around something neither was ready to name, an attraction that complicated every calculation Elena tried to make about her future. The complication arrived on a Thursday morning, when Ada appeared at Elena's door with an expression that suggested news she didn't want to deliver. "There's been a development," she said, her usual warmth replaced by professional neutrality. "Mr. Caruso would like to speak with you in his office." Elena found Dominic standing at a window that overlooked the front gate, his posture rigid in ways she'd learned to recognize as anger being carefully contained. Two of his lieutenants occupied chairs near his desk, their expressions carved from stone that suggested the news she was about to receive wouldn't be pleasant. "Close the door," Dominic said without turning. "What I'm about to tell you changes things." Elena did as instructed, her leg protesting the sudden movements that anxiety provoked. "What happened?" "The Castellano situation I mentioned when you arrived, the connection Marco established between my organization and theirs." He finally turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "They've made demands. Specifically, they want proof that you're no longer a threat. Proof that my people can't provide without delivering you to them directly." The words landed like physical blows, each one driving home the reality that safety had always been temporary. "What kind of proof?" Her voice emerged steadier than she felt. "They want you to disappear. Either through arrangement with them, or through evidence convincing, enough that they believe you're dead." Dominic moved closer, his voice dropping. "I'm not delivering you to anyone, and I'm not staging your death, which means we need to find another way to resolve their concerns." "What way?" One of the lieutenants spoke for the first time. "We could take the fight to them directly, eliminate enough of their leadership that they're too busy with succession to worry about witnesses. That starts a war," Dominic said. "Wars have casualties on both sides. Elena and Matteo would remain targets throughout, and there's no guarantee of their safety even after we won." Elena listened to them discuss her future as if she weren't present. Strategies and counter-strategies that treated her life as a variable in equations she didn't fully understand. The helplessness she'd felt in the parking structure returned, the recognition that forces beyond her control were determining her fate. What if I testified? The question emerged from somewhere she hadn't known. Existed the part of her that refused to remain passive, while others decided her destiny. Every head in the room turned toward her. "What?" Dominic's voice carried genuine surprise. "You said Marco was running product for the Castellanos using your infrastructure. That means documentation exists, shipment records, financial transactions, evidence that could bring federal attention to their operations." Elena's mind raced through implications she hadn't previously considered. "If I testified as a witness to what I saw, brought it to the FBI or the DEA, that shifts the target from just me to their entire organization. They'd have bigger problems than one nurse who glimpsed some boxes in a parking structure." The silence that followed her suggestion stretched uncomfortably, filled with calculations she couldn't follow. "That would also bring federal attention to my operations," Dominic said finally, his voice neutral in ways that suggested he was still processing her proposal. "Yes." Elena met his eyes directly. "It would. Is that worse than war?" The question hung between them, forcing choices that had no comfortable answers. She was asking him to accept government scrutiny. In exchange for ending the immediate threat, she represented a trade that might cost him more than protecting her was worth. "Give me 24 hours, he said. "I need to think about implications you haven't considered." Elena nodded, accepting the delay while recognizing that she'd just changed something fundamental about their dynamic. She was no longer just someone being protected, she was an active participant in solving a problem that affected them both. The walk back to her room felt longer than it should have. Each step weighted with the knowledge that whatever happened next, she had chosen involvement over passivity. Matteo looked up from his homework when she entered. "Is everything okay?" Elena considered lying. The instinct to protect him from adult complications remained strong. But he had earned honesty through the courage that had brought them here, through his willingness to face danger that should have been beyond his years. "There are people who want to hurt us," she said carefully. "Mr. Dominic is working on making sure they can't. But it might mean some difficult decisions in the days ahead." Her brother set down his pencil with the solemnity of someone who understood that childhood occasionally required adult responses. "Does he know we trust him?" The question cut through every complication Elena had been turning over in her mind, reducing months of moral complexity to the simple assessment of a child. "I think he does," she said. Matteo nodded, apparently satisfied. "Then it'll be okay. He's a man of his word." Elena wished she could share her brother's certainty, but as she watched him return to his homework, she recognized that trust, however complicated, however earned through circumstances neither of them had chosen, was the only foundation available for whatever came next. The confrontation arrived before Dominic's 24 hours had elapsed. Elena was walking the garden path she'd claimed as her rehabilitation route when the sound of vehicles approaching too fast shattered the morning's quiet. Her body recognized danger before her mind could catalog it, the surge of adrenaline. The instinct to move toward shelter that her healing leg couldn't quite support. Gunfire erupted somewhere near the front gate, the distinctive crack of weapons discharge carrying across distances that suddenly felt inadequate between threat and safety. She ran toward the house on legs that screamed protest, her cast and anchor dragging against speed she desperately needed. Matteo was inside. Matteo was alone except for Ada and whatever security remained after the attack had drawn responders to the perimeter. The back entrance loomed ahead, its door already opening to reveal Dominic emerging with a weapon in his hand and an expression that transformed every feature into something she'd never seen before. Not the man who discussed philosophy over dinner, but the predator his reputation described. "Get inside." His voice carried no room for argument. "Take Matteo to the basement and stay there until I come for you." "What's happening?" Castellanos decided not to wait for my decision. He moved past her toward the sounds of conflict, then paused to look back with something in his eyes that might have been fear not for himself, but for what he was leaving unprotected behind him. "Elena, whatever happens, you were right about the testimony. Make the call if I can't." Then he was gone, disappearing around the corner of the house toward a battle she couldn't see and couldn't help him fight. Elena ran. The house's interior had transformed into a different space staff, moving with purpose that suggested drills practiced for exactly this scenario. Doors being secured, windows being checked. Ada appeared from a hallway, Matteo's hand firmly in her grip, her face showing none of the warmth Elena had grown accustomed to seeing. "Basement," Ada said. "Now." They descended stairs Elena hadn't known existed, into a space that revealed itself as a bunker designed for exactly this emergency. Reinforced walls, supplies stacked against the far corner, communication equipment that hummed with activity she didn't understand. Matteo pressed against her side, his body trembling with fear he was trying desperately to hide. Elena wrapped her arm around him and held on, offering comfort she wasn't sure she possessed, while sounds of violence filtered through the ceiling above them. The waiting lasted 47 minutes. Elena counted them through the steady progression of her watch's second hand, each passing moment another uncertainty in a timeline she couldn't control. When the door finally opened, Dominic appeared in the frame alive, whole, wearing blood that she desperately hoped wasn't his. His eyes found hers across the bunker's dim interior, and something passed between them that words couldn't have captured. "It's over," he said. "They won't come again." The certainty in his voice carried implications she didn't want to examine too closely. She simply nodded, accepting the safety he was offering without asking its price. Later, after Matteo had been settled into bed with assurances that the loud noises were finished, Elena found Dominic in the library they'd both come to use as neutral territory. He stood before a window that looked onto grounds now scarred by conflict. Tire marks in gravel, bullet holes in gateposts, evidence of violence that would need to be erased before the world outside could see. "How many?" she asked, meaning his people. "2 wounded. Torres again." "Actually, he's developing a habit." Dominic's voice carried exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. "The men who came, they won't be sending reports back." Elena crossed to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "And tomorrow? Tomorrow I make calls that ensure today doesn't repeat. The Castellano leadership will receive messages they can't ignore about the cost of attacking what I've claimed." What he'd claimed. The phrase landed with weight she felt in her chest, the recognition that somewhere in the past weeks, she and Matteo had moved from protected witnesses to something more significant, something worth defending with violence that had transformed his garden into a battlefield. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly. "Any of it. The attack, the protection, She stopped, unsure what word could capture the complexity of what had developed between them. "I know." Dominic turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw the same uncertainty she felt, the recognition that they had crossed into territory neither had mapped. "But some things happen regardless of what we ask for. The question is what we do with them once they arrive." Elena considered the question in the light filtering through windows that had witnessed gunfire hours earlier. She thought about Matteo sleeping peacefully despite everything, about the work she'd done in the basement clinic that had saved lives, operating outside every law she'd been taught to respect, about the man standing before her who had become something she couldn't easily categorize. "I'm not going anywhere," she said finally. "Not because I can't, but because I'm choosing to stay." The admission hung between them, transforming obligation into something voluntary, something that carried the weight of genuine commitment. Dominic reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible given what those hands had done today. "Elena, don't promise me anything." She covered his hand with her own, holding it against her face. "Just keep being someone who keeps his word. That's enough for now." He nodded slowly, accepting the terms she was offering. Outside, the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, promising a tomorrow that neither of them could fully predict but that both had apparently chosen to face together. 6 weeks after the attack, Elena stood before the bathroom mirror and traced the scar that now bisected her hairline, a thin white line that makeup could hide but memory couldn't erase. The stitches had dissolved weeks ago, leaving behind evidence of the night that had redirected the entire trajectory of her existence. Her leg had healed well. The cast had been removed, replaced first by a walking boot and then by physical therapy sessions that had gradually restored strength she'd feared might never return. She could walk normally now, climb stairs, even run short distances if urgency required it. But the woman staring back from the mirror had changed in ways that had nothing to do with physical recovery. The house had become home in ways she hadn't expected and couldn't quite explain. She knew which floorboards creaked in the hallway outside her room, which windows caught the morning light in patterns she found beautiful, which seats in the library offered the best reading angles. She knew Ada's schedule, the security team's rotation patterns, the particular way Dominic's footsteps sounded when he approached from the east wing. She knew things she shouldn't know about a life she had never asked to enter. Matteo's laughter carried from somewhere in the garden below her window, a sound so ordinary it almost hurt. Normalcy emerging from circumstances that defied every definition of the word. He was playing with the groundskeeper's daughter, a girl his age who had been appearing more frequently since the adults had decided that children benefited from companionship with peers. Her brother had adapted completely. The fear she'd seen in his eyes the night of the attack had faded, replaced by the resilience children possessed when their fundamental needs, safety, stability, love were consistently met. He talked about Dominic with the casual affection usually reserved for family members, referring to Mr. Dom's opinions and preferences as if they carried the weight of parental authority. The observation should have alarmed her. Instead, it provoked something closer to grief, mourning for the simpler life she'd tried to build before Marco Benedetti had decided she posed a threat, before her brother had walked into a restaurant and changed everything by grabbing a stranger's coat. A knock at her door interrupted the spiral of her thoughts. "Elena?" Ada's voice carried through the wood with its characteristic efficiency. "Mr. Caruso would like to see you in the study when you have a moment." "I'll be right there." She found Dominic seated behind the desk that had become the center of his operations since the attack, a massive piece of mahogany covered with papers that Elena had learned not to examine too closely. His expression carried the particular tension she'd learned to associate with news he didn't want to deliver. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "We need to talk about something." Elena settled into leather that had molded itself to her shape over countless conversations in this room. "What's happened?" The Castellano situation has evolved. Dominic's fingers drummed once against the desk, a tell she'd learned to recognize as the prelude to information that required careful delivery. Their leadership has fragmented since the attack. The faction that ordered the assault on this house no longer controls the family's operations. That sounds like good news. It should be, except the new leadership has made contact with terms for permanent peace. He paused, and something in his hesitation made Elena's stomach tighten. They want a meeting, face-to-face, neutral territory, to negotiate arrangements that would end the threat to you and your brother permanently. Elena processed this information, searching for the complication that his tone suggested existed beneath the surface of apparent resolution. What's the catch? They've specified that you attend the meeting personally. Something about needing assurance that the witness they've been hunting isn't being held against her will, that any agreement has your genuine consent. The request made sense from a certain angle, ensuring that promises made on her behalf would actually bind her to whatever terms were negotiated. But it also meant exposure, vulnerability, entering a space where the power dynamics she'd grown accustomed to navigating from behind Dominic's protection would shift dramatically. When, 3 days from now, a restaurant in the city, public enough that violence would draw attention neither side wants. Dominic leaned forward, his eyes searching her face. I can refuse. Tell them that your safety isn't negotiable, that they'll have to accept terms delivered through intermediaries. And if you refuse, the fragmentation continues. Factions that might have accepted peace find reasons to keep fighting. The threat to you remains active, possibly for years, while I work to eliminate everyone who knows your name. His jaw tightened. I can do it. I will do it, if that's what you want. But it's a longer road with more casualties along the way. Elena absorbed the weight of the choice being offered. She could remain protected, passive, a valuable object requiring defense, while others bled for her safety. Or she could step forward, participate in ending the conflict that her accidental witness had helped create, accept agency that came with risks she hadn't faced since the parking structure. What do you think I should do? The question surprised Dominic. She could see it in the brief widening of his eyes before his expression returned to careful neutrality. People apparently didn't often ask for his opinion on matters where his preference seemed obvious. I think you're not the same woman who arrived here 2 months ago. His voice carried something that might have been admiration. I think you've shown strength that most people never discover they possess, and I think you deserve the chance to help end this, rather than waiting for others to end it for you. But I also know what it costs to sit across from people who want you dead and pretend that civilized conversation is possible. I know the nightmares that come after, the way violence changes the shape of your thoughts. He reached across the desk, his hand stopping just short of hers. I wouldn't ask this of you if there were another way. Elena looked at his hand, the fingers that had killed, protected, and traced paths across her skin. In moments of intimacy they'd both pretended were simpler than they were. She thought about Matteo laughing in the garden, about the clinic in the basement where she'd saved lives operating outside every law she'd been trained to respect, about the woman in the mirror who no longer recognized her former self. I'll go, she said, but I have conditions. Dominic's expression shifted to something approaching respect. Name them. First, I want to understand exactly what's being negotiated. Not summaries or simplified versions, the actual terms, explained well enough that I can participate meaningfully, rather than just nodding when someone tells me to. Done. Second, I want Matteo somewhere truly safe. Not here, where an attack could still reach him. Somewhere far enough away that even if everything goes wrong, he has a chance. I have a property in Wisconsin, near the border, isolated, defensible, staffed by people I trust absolutely. He can be there within hours. Elena nodded, accepting this arrangement despite the ache that came from planning separation from her brother. Third, and this is the hardest one, I need you to promise that if something happens to me, you'll make sure Matteo is taken care of. Not just protected, but raised by someone who'll love him, given the kind of life I was trying to give him before any of this happened. The request landed with weight that silenced whatever response Dominic had been preparing. He studied her face as if seeing something new, something that reconfigured his understanding of who she had become during her time under his roof. "You're planning for your death. I'm planning for possibilities." Elena held his gaze without flinching. "The woman I was 2 months ago would have let other people handle this while she hid in a basement. That woman is gone. What replaced her understands that endings can't always be controlled, only prepared for." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, calculations visible behind his eyes as he weighed her words against everything he knew about obligation and care. "If something happens to you," he said finally, his voice rough in ways that betrayed emotion he typically concealed, "Matteo will be raised as my own. He'll have every opportunity I can provide, every protection my position allows. He'll know his sister loved him enough to fight for his future, and he'll grow up understanding that courage is a choice people make when the alternative is unacceptable." The promise landed in Elena's chest like something physical, a weight that was somehow lighter than the uncertainty it replaced. Whatever happened in 3 days, her brother would survive, would thrive, would become someone who carried her love forward into a life she might not be present to witness. "Then I'll go," she said, "and I'll help end this." The 3 days passed with the strange elasticity of time experienced under pressure, hours that stretched into eternities during moments of anxiety, then collapsed into seconds when she wanted more of them. Elena spent mornings with Matteo, storing memories against the possibility that they might need to sustain her through whatever came next. She told him about the meeting using language simple enough for his understanding, but honest enough that he wouldn't feel deceived if things went wrong. "There are people who want to stop being angry at us," she explained as they walked the garden path she'd claimed during her recovery. "I'm going to meet with them and try to help everyone agree to be peaceful instead of fighting." Matteo considered this with the gravity she'd learned to expect from him. "Will Mr. Dom protect you? He'll try, but sometimes protecting someone means letting them do things that seem dangerous, because the alternative is worse. Like when I went to find him at the restaurant." Her brother's observation cut through every layer of adult complexity to find the simple truth beneath. "You were bleeding, and staying hidden was worse than the scary thing I had to do." Elena pulled him against her side, overwhelmed by love for this small person who understood sacrifice and courage in ways most adults never managed. "Exactly like that. Then you should go." Matteo's voice carried certainty that seemed borrowed from someone much older. "And you should come back, because I need you to help with my homework and Mr. Dom makes the tutors explain things wrong." She laughed despite everything, a sound that felt like release, like permission to believe that survival was possible even when the odds suggested otherwise. The night before the meeting, she found Dominic in the library they'd both come to think of as shared territory. He stood before the window where she'd once watched him absorb the aftermath of violence, his reflection ghosting across glass that looked onto darkness. "Couldn't sleep," she said, though the observation was unnecessary. "Neither could I." He didn't turn to face her. "I keep running scenarios, calculating probabilities, trying to find the version of tomorrow where every possible outcome ends with you walking back through my door." Elena crossed to stand beside him, close enough that their arms touched. "That's not how the world works." "I know. That's why I can't sleep." She studied his reflection, the profile that had become familiar during months of shared meals and careful conversations, the tension in his shoulders that never fully released regardless of how stable the moment seemed. "Tell me something true," she said. "Something you haven't told anyone else." Dominic was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight that seemed to come from somewhere deep and rarely accessed. "I became this because I didn't know how to become anything else. My father built something that required continuation, and I was the only one positioned to continue it. Every choice since then has been about maintenance, keeping the machine running, preventing the kind of chaos that would hurt more people than the order we provide." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I never asked if there might be something different. Something that didn't require becoming the person everyone expects me to be. And now? Now there's you." He finally turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw vulnerability that his reputation insisted didn't exist. Someone who sees the machine I've built and asks questions I've spent years avoiding. Someone who makes me wonder what I might become if I had the courage to change. Elena reached up to touch his face, a gesture that had become familiar during the intimacy they'd developed without ever fully acknowledging its implications. Change doesn't require courage. It just requires deciding that what you are isn't what you want to keep being. That simple? That complicated? She smiled slightly. But possible. I'm proof of that. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly as if absorbing comfort he rarely allowed himself to accept. If tomorrow goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. I need you to know that these months have mattered, that whatever I am, whatever I've done, the time with you and Matteo has been the closest I've come to understanding what people mean when they talk about home. Elena rose on her toes to press her lips against his, a kiss that carried everything they hadn't found words for, everything the morning might make impossible. He responded with gentle intensity, his hands finding her waist as if memorizing the shape of her against him. When they finally separated, both breathing harder than the contact should have warranted, she rested her forehead against his. Then make sure we have time to keep building it, she said. That's all I'm asking. Not guarantees, just time. I'll do everything in my power. I know. She stepped back, creating distance that felt necessary for what came next. I should try to sleep. Tomorrow matters too much for me to face it exhausted. Dominic nodded, releasing her with visible reluctance. Elena. She paused at the library door. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already changed things. Not just for me, for everyone who works under my authority, who sees me interact with you and Matteo, and wonders if different might be possible. His voice carried conviction that seemed to surprise even him. That matters. That will keep mattering long after this particular crisis is resolved. She carried his words to bed with her, holding them against the darkness that wanted to crowd in with fears about the morning. Sleep came eventually, fitful but present, and she dreamed of nothing she could remember when light finally crept through her windows. The restaurant occupied a corner of Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood, expensive enough to discourage casual violence, public enough that both sides would need to maintain civilized facades regardless of the hatred operating beneath. Elena entered flanked by Dominic and two of his lieutenants, her posture carrying composure she'd practiced in the mirror until it felt almost natural. The Castellano representatives had arrived first, three men whose faces she didn't recognize, but whose body language communicated the particular tension of people managing hostile negotiations. They rose when she approached, courtesy that felt performative but necessary for the theater both sides were conducting. Miss Reyes. The one who spoke appeared to be in his 50s, silver threading through dark hair in patterns that suggested distinguished rather than aged. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Thank you for asking. Elena settled into the chair Dominic pulled out for her, grateful for the small gesture of support. I understand you have terms to discuss. The negotiation that followed lasted 2 hours, during which Elena listened more than she spoke, cataloging demands and concessions, and the subtle indicators of where flexibility might exist. The Castellanos wanted assurance that she would never testify about what she'd witnessed, a promise she could give honestly, since the federal option had always been leverage rather than genuine intention. In exchange, they offered formal acknowledgement that she and Matteo existed under Dominic's protection, that any action against them would be treated as action against his organization itself. You're essentially asking to be made invisible, the silver-haired negotiator observed, studying Elena with interest that seemed to extend beyond the immediate transaction. Most witnesses in your position would want more. Compensation, relocation assistance, something to show for the disruption you've experienced. Elena considered her response carefully, aware that this moment mattered in ways that extended beyond the specific terms being negotiated. I want my brother to grow up without looking over his shoulder. I want to work and live and eventually build something that looks like a normal life, even if it exists in unusual circumstances. She met his eyes directly. Money doesn't provide any of that. Invisibility does. Something shifted in the negotiator's expression, respect, perhaps, or recognition of a sophistication he hadn't expected from someone whose involvement in their world had been purely accidental. You understand that this agreement binds you as well, he said. Whatever protection Mr. Caruso provides, whatever relationship exists between you that becomes part of our consideration. If you leave him, the terms we're establishing today may no longer apply. The condition was simultaneously reasonable and manipulative, ensuring that whatever personal connection she'd developed with Dominic became entangled with her. Practical safety in ways that would complicate any future desire for independence. Elena glanced at Dominic, whose expression revealed nothing about how he felt regarding the constraint being imposed. Then she looked back at the Castellano negotiator with calm certainty. I'm not planning to leave, but if your peace depends on my remaining somewhere I don't want to be, then we should discuss what happens in that scenario now, rather than discovering later that our agreement has gaps. The response created visible recalculation among the Castellano delegation, recognition that Elena wasn't simply accepting terms but actively negotiating them, despite her lack of formal authority or experience in their world. The silver-haired man leaned back in his chair, something approaching a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Mr. Caruso, your witness is more formidable than I expected. She's not my witness. Dominic's voice carried edges that made the temperature at the table drop several degrees. She's someone who happened to see something she shouldn't have, and responded with more courage than most people demonstrate in their entire lives. The relationship between us exists independent of the circumstances that created it. The declaration landed with weight that Elena felt in her chest, a public acknowledgement of something they'd both been circling without naming. Whatever she meant to Dominic. He just announced it to people whose primary currency was information and leverage. The Castellano negotiator absorbed this development with the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent decades reading implications. Then perhaps we should adjust our terms. If Miss Reyes's connection to your organization is personal rather than circumstantial, the agreement should reflect that reality. What followed was an additional hour of negotiation, during which Elena's status evolved from protected witness to something more complex, an acknowledgement that she occupied a position in Dominic's world that demanded specific consideration. The final terms included provisions for her safety that extended beyond his immediate authority, protections that would survive even if their relationship changed or ended. She had walked into this meeting as someone requiring defense. She was walking out as someone who had helped negotiate peace on terms that recognized her agency. The return to the house carried a different quality than the departure, relief mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the strange disorientation of crisis resolved. Matteo wouldn't return from Wisconsin until the following day, giving Elena time to process everything that had happened before facing her brother's questions. She found herself in the garden as evening settled over the grounds, walking the path that had become her meditation route during months of recovery and transformation. The air carried the sharp edge of approaching winter, cold enough to clear her thoughts, but not yet harsh enough to drive her inside. Dominic appeared from the direction of the house, his suit jacket removed and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, a casual presentation she'd rarely witnessed during their months together. He moved to walk beside her without speaking, matching her pace as they navigated the familiar circuit. "You were impressive today," he said finally. "The way you handled their conditions, turned leverage into something that actually protects you. I've worked with negotiators for 20 years who couldn't have managed what you did. I had good teachers." Elena's response carried layers of meaning that included him but extended beyond the immediate context. "The nurses I trained under, the patients who showed me what dignity looks like under pressure. Even Matteo, everyone teaches you something if you're paying attention. And what did I teach you?" The question deserved serious consideration, so Elena gave it the silence that serious thinking required. They completed half the garden circuit before she answered. "You taught me that power doesn't automatically corrupt, that someone can hold authority over others and still choose to use it carefully, thoughtfully, with awareness of the damage careless decisions can cause." She paused, searching for words precise enough to capture her meaning. Before you, I assumed everyone in your position was the same predators who had simply found legal loopholes for their predation. You showed me that the choice to be decent is always available, regardless of the circumstances that surround it. Dominic was quiet for a long moment, processing her assessment with the care it deserved. That might be the kindest thing anyone has ever said about me. It's not kindness, it's observation. Elena stopped walking, turning to face him in the fading light. I've watched you for months now. Watched how you treat the people who work for you, how you handle situations where cruelty would be easier than patience, how you've raised Matteo's expectations about what adults should be by simply being reliable in his presence. Whatever you've done in your past, whoever you had to become to survive in this world, that's not all you are. Elena. His voice caught on her name, emotion breaking through the control he typically maintained. I'm not finished. She stepped closer, close enough to see the way. The evening light caught the silver at his temples. Today changed things. Not just the agreement with the Castellanos, but what you said about our relationship, about it being personal rather than circumstantial. I meant it. I know you did. That's why I need to say something I should have said weeks ago, before the attack made everything feel too urgent for careful conversation. She took a breath, steadying herself for words that would eliminate any remaining ambiguity about where they stood. I love you, not because you saved me, or because you protect Matteo, or because this house has become the closest thing to home I've known since my parents died. I love you because you're a person worth loving, despite everything the world thinks it knows about who you are. The confession hung between them, vulnerable and exposed in ways that Elena had spent her entire adult life avoiding. She had learned early that love made you weak, that attachment created opportunities for loss that could hollow you out from the inside. But somewhere in the months of recovery and revelation, she'd stopped believing that protection from pain was worth the price of protection from joy. Dominic reached for her, his hands finding her waist with the gentle certainty of someone who had been holding back for far too long. I've been waiting to hear those words since the night you stood in my library and asked me to keep being someone who keeps his word. That long? Longer, probably. But that was when I stopped pretending it might be something else. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. I love you, Elena. I love who you were when you arrived here. Terrified and proud and determined to maintain dignity despite circumstances that should have crushed it. I love who you've become, someone who negotiates with dangerous men and makes them reconsider their assumptions. I love that your brother thinks I explain things wrong and that you laugh at my security protocols and that you've transformed this house from a fortress into something that actually feels like it matters. She kissed him then, pouring months of restraint and uncertainty into contact that finally acknowledged everything they'd been building beneath the surface of careful conversation. His arms wrapped around her completely, holding her against him as if memorizing the shape of a future they'd both been afraid to imagine. When they finally separated, both breathless in ways that had nothing to do with exertion, Elena found herself laughing, a sound of pure release that echoed across the garden and probably reached whatever security personnel were pretending not to monitor the grounds. What? Dominic's voice carried amused confusion. I'm laughing because my brother was right. She grinned up at him with joy she hadn't felt in years. He said it would be okay because you keep your promises. And here we are. Here we are, he agreed, something in his expression softening into contentment that made him look younger than his years. Though I should probably tell you that Matteo has been asking me for weeks when I'm going to tell you how I feel. Apparently my ability to hide emotional states doesn't extend to 6-year-olds. 7 next month, Elena corrected automatically. He'll be 7. And yes, he mentioned that Mr. Dom seemed sad sometimes but got happier when I was around. I may have dismissed that as childish imagination. It was distressingly accurate observation. They stood together as full darkness claimed the garden, holding each other in the space between crisis and whatever came next. Elena could feel the rhythm of his heartbeat against her chest, steady and present, and real in ways that made everything else feel manageable. What happens now? The question emerged without anxiety, genuine curiosity about the shape of their shared future. Now we bring Matteo home. We continue building whatever this becomes. I keep working on the changes. You've inspired me to consider. And you keep telling me when I'm being a fool about things most people are too afraid to mention. Dominic pressed a kiss to her forehead. Now we find out what happens when two people who never expected to find each other decide they're worth the complications that choosing each other creates. Elena nodded against his chest, accepting the uncertainty that came with any genuine commitment, while trusting that they would navigate it together. The house glowed with warm light as they walked back toward its entrance. Transformed in her perception from temporary shelter to permanent home, she thought about the woman who had arrived here months ago, injured, frightened, maintaining pride as armor against circumstances that should have broken her, and marveled at the distance between that person and who she had become. Some changes happened suddenly, in moments of crisis that demanded immediate transformation. But the most important changes happened slowly, accumulated through countless small choices that added up to someone new. She had become someone new, and she was exactly where she wanted to be. 2 years later, Elena stood in the same garden where everything had shifted, watching Matteo chase fireflies across grass that had seen seasons turn since the night she'd first walked its paths on healing legs. Her brother was 9, now tall for his age, confident in ways that reflected stability she hadn't been able to provide before. Circumstances she'd never have chosen, granted her access to resources she'd never have earned. The diamond on her left hand caught starlight as she raised her glass to her lips, wine from the vineyard Dominic had acquired in their first year together. The wedding had been small, just family and the closest associates, who had become something like extended relatives over time. Ada had cried, which Elena still found amusing given the woman's usual composure. He's going to catch cold if he keeps running around without his jacket. Dominic appeared beside her, his own wine glass in hand, his presence settling into the space next to her with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged there. He's 9. Cold is theoretical until it actually affects him. Elena leaned into her husband's side, absorbing warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Besides, when's the last time you successfully convinced him to do anything he'd already decided against? Valid point. He gets that from you, by the way. I prefer to think of it as good judgment rather than stubbornness. Those are the same thing, depending on perspective. They watched their brother because Dominic had adopted Matteo formally on their first anniversary, transforming legal responsibility into something more permanent. Capture a firefly in cupped hands and release it immediately, the boy's delight evident even from this distance. The Castellano heir is getting married next month, Dominic mentioned, the observation carrying weight that Elena had learned to recognize. We've been invited. Should we go? It would be good politics. Evidence that the peace we negotiated actually holds. Elena considered the implications of attending a celebration hosted by people who had once wanted her dead, the strange normalcy that 2 years of maintained agreements had created between organizations that had previously operated in conflict. Fine. But I'm choosing my own dress this time. The last event you picked something for. I looked like I was auditioning for a role in a period drama. You looked elegant. I looked like I was wearing curtains. Expensive curtains, but curtains. Dominic laughed, a sound that still surprised her sometimes. The ease with which joy had come to live in his voice since they'd built something together worth laughing about. Noted. Complete autonomy on formal wear choices. The house behind them glowed with lights that Elena had helped choose during the renovation they'd undertaken after the wedding changes that transformed Dominic's fortress into a space that felt like it belonged to both of them. Her clinic still occupied the basement, though the cases she treated now came less frequently as the organization's operations evolved toward activities that generated fewer injuries. Progress, Dominic called it, the slow process of becoming something different without losing the capacity to be what circumstances sometimes still required. Elena called it enough. Enough change to matter, enough continuity to maintain stability, enough hope to keep reaching toward versions of themselves they might not yet be capable of imagining. I should get Matteo inside, she said, setting down her wine glass. School tomorrow, and he's already negotiating for extra reading time before bed. He's going to be a lawyer, or a politician, possibly both, given his talent for persuasion. He's going to be whatever he wants to be. Elena smiled at her husband, this Man who had once seemed like everything she should fear, who had become everything she hadn't known she needed. That's the point, isn't it? Giving him enough possibilities that his future actually belongs to him. Dominic pulled her into an embrace that felt like home, like all the accumulated moments of their shared life condensed into a single point of contact. That's exactly the point, he agreed. For all of us. She crossed the garden to collect her brother, the boy who had once walked into danger to save her, and had ended up saving all of them in ways none of them could have predicted. Matteo's hand found hers automatically as they walked back toward light and warmth, and the life they'd somehow managed to build from the wreckage of that night in the parking structure. Mom. The word still sent complicated joy through Elena's chest every time he used it, the title he'd started using naturally after the adoption without anyone suggesting he should. Can we have pancakes tomorrow? Mr. Torres said he'd teach me the special recipe if you said it was okay. On a school day? It's educational. Cultural heritage and culinary technique. His grin revealed gaps where baby teeth had recently departed. Plus, they taste really good. Elena laughed, the sound carrying across grounds that had witnessed violence and healing and everything in between. Fine. Pancakes tomorrow. But you're helping clean up. Deal. They entered the house together, leaving the garden to fireflies and starlight and the quiet certainty that some stories ended not with resolution, but with continuation. The promise that whatever came next, they would face it as a family. The door closed behind them, sealing warmth inside against the cool night air. And somewhere in the space between what they had been and what they were becoming, a life continued to unfold in directions none of them could have predicted, built on courage, sustained by love, and carrying forward into futures worth fighting for. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.